everyone. I'm Georgia Erger. I'm the assistant curator here at the MSU Broad. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're joined by Dr. Marjorie Agosin and Dr. Edward Murphy in conversation with Dr. Mark Auslander to learn about the oppressive social, political, and cultural conditions of General Pinochet's dictatorship in Chile and other countries in the region through art and dissident expression created by those who lived it. This co-sponsored program invites you to engage with the parallel exhibitions on view at our two museums, Between Absence and Presence, the Arpillera Movement in Chile, on view through November 30th at the MSU Museum, and The Edge of Things, Dissident Art Under Repressive Regimes, on view through January 5th here at the MSU Broad. We also encourage you to join the conversation, Envisioning Hope, the story of the Chilean Arpilleras with Dr. Agosin tomorrow at 5:30 at the MSU Museum. So the exhibition, Between Absence and Presence, the Arpilleras Movement in Chile, highlights the significant works of popular art in Chile, known as arpilleras, created during the dictatorship and post-dictatorship period. Arpilleras came to international attention during the violent period of General Pinochet's military dictatorship from 1973 through 1990. Created by mostly working-class women, these works, composed of colorful fabric scraps stitched onto burlap backings, commemorate family members disappeared by the military and security forces and depict the difficulties of everyday life under martial law. More recent arpilleras reflect upon Chile's tumultuous history of repression and democracy and envision a more hopeful future for the nation. This important collection, dating from the early 1970s through to the present, has been assembled by Dr. Agosin, who has for decades worked closely with women arpillera artists, helping document their stories and aid them in their continuing struggle for financial security. And then the exhibition, The Edge of Things, Dissident Art Under Repressive Regimes, on view in the MSU Broad second floor galleries, gathers experimental works from the 1960s through late 1980s created by artists working under military dictatorships in Argentina, Chile, and Brazil. These artists questioned their role in society and the purpose of art itself, specifically the political function art can have in making visible what has been erased or disappeared. They faced oppressive social, political, and cultural conditions, including the persecution, torture, disappearance, and murder of dissident citizens. In expressing resistance to coercive military dictatorships, they navigated fluid lines between art and politics, public and private space, and experimented with non-traditional art forms and materials, often turning to their own bodies or the streets to denounce state-sanctioned violence. The artists represented in the exhibition seek to make visible what was and is pushed to the edges of official state narratives. The exhibition, The Edge of Things, is curated by Carla Acevedo Yates, our assistant curator, who is now recently appointed curator at the MCA Chicago, and was supported by Thais Wenstrom, who is in the audience right now, who is our curatorial intern, and Patrick O'Grady, a graduate fellow in history. So before we begin, I would like to briefly introduce our speakers. Dr. Marjorie Agosin is the Luella Lemare Slanner Professor in Latin American Studies and a professor of Spanish at Wellesley College. In both her scholarship and creative work, Dr. Agosin focuses on social justice, feminism, and remembrance. She is the author of numerous works of poetry, fiction, and literary criticism. Dr. Agosin has received numerous honors and awards for her writing and work as a human rights activist, including a Jeanette Rankin Award in Human Rights and a United Nations Leadership Award for Human Rights. Additionally, the Chilean government honored her with a Gabriela Mistral Medal for Lifetime Achievement. Dr. Edward Murphy is an associate professor in the Department of History and Global Urban Studies at MSU. His work explores themes of mass urbanization, inequality, domesticity, state formation, and political economy in Latin America, with a particular focus on the property regimes and social movements of low-income groups through processes of socialist revolution and neoliberal reaction in Chile. And finally, Dr. Mark Auslander is director of the MSU Museum and an associate professor of anthropology and history at MSU. He works at the intersection of ritual practice, aesthetics, environmental transformation, kinship, and political consciousness in sub-Saharan Africa and the African diaspora. His Africanist work on kinship, aesthetics, placemaking, and political cosmology informs his scholarship and curatorial work on race and cultural politics in the African diaspora in North America. So please join me in welcoming our guests, and we look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. It's just wonderful, after a 10-year absence, to welcome Marjorie back to the MSU campus. I will mention that one of my very first conversations in the previous location of Strange Matter was with Ed, as we were thinking about ways to conceptualize the relationship between precarity and artistic and cultural production, and we dreamed of this day of actually bringing Marjorie and her wonderful collection back, and that, of course, deepened with Carla's wonderful curatorial work, which you can all see upstairs. But we thought we'd start, Ed, with Ed helping us contextualize a little bit historically the circumstances that lead to the production of the work in both museums, with some attention to the complex relationship between cultural form, economics, and repression in its many forms.
All right, well, thank you, and thanks for coming. It's nice that we can be intimate. We said, put it that way. And I do want to say I'm just thrilled to share the stage with Marjorie. The Arpilleras were very influential for me in becoming interested in Latin America to begin with, and I learned about Marjorie's work with them quite a long time ago now, more than 25 years ago. And as I say, that really set me off on my own path towards discovering Latin America and now doing what I do. So I'm thrilled to be on the stage with her. I wanted to just say a few things about these two exhibits. And mostly it's been wonderful that they're here on campus, and I'm appreciative to both the Broad and to the museum for having them. But as I've had the opportunity to wander through them on multiple occasions, one of the things that really struck me is just the ways in which the art itself speaks to the wide-ranging and multi-stranded forms of repression that exist in the regimes themselves. You really kind of get a sense of the many kinds of things that the dissidents had to react to in terms of the repression. So I wanted to speak a little bit to that. And first I want to raise just a kind of very broad general point about the kinds of regimes that existed, some of my interpretive understanding of what they did historically for the trajectory of Latin America, for the history of the Cold War, and for the history really of the globe in many ways. But then I want to get a little bit into some of the ideological fury of these regimes and look a little bit at some of the specific ways in which they had very intense, wide-ranging ideological projects that cast a whole wide range of people as enemies. And as I say, I think you can see that in the exhibits themselves. And then I'll just tie it together, hopefully, by concluding with a few of the ways in which you see this in the exhibits. But I will be brief, because, as I said, I'm thrilled to be here with Marjorie, and I want to hear what she has to say. So, first, in terms of kind of the broader geopolitical context, I think, first of all, it's just really important to recognize that in mid-20th century Latin America, you, broadly speaking, had a number of different political movements that were very much inspired by reform and revolution. These were also very diverse movements. They had their flaws, but they were nonetheless tied together by a kind of effort to overturn the existing order. Some historians have spoken about this as providing a kind of heretical challenge to the way in which business had worked in Latin America before then. So this was about upsetting sort of well-established oligarchies. It was also about upsetting the well-established ties that these oligarchies had with the United States government. And the different kinds of regimes or the different kinds of movements that rose seeking deep kinds of reform and also revolution tended to tie these things together. They tied them together in terms of both having an anti-imperialist kind of component, one that was explicitly anti-American in many of the ways in which it worked. And it also sought fundamental change in these societies, in the ways the economies worked, also in terms of the kinds of rights that people could have in their everyday lives. So these were movements that were driven by a sense of people should have a right to things like housing, people should have a right to education, people should have a right to healthcare. And as I say, this represented a real kind of heretical challenge and a real change. And as I also say, as diverse as these different movements were, it's broadly speaking something that brought these movements across Latin America together. It was also something that very much signaled the relative empowerment of a number of previously excluded marginalized groups. And so while this was supported by organized labor, student organizations, campesino groups and things like that, it also meant that a lot of people would suddenly have access to rights, would suddenly be involved in political processes and social processes in a way that they haven't before. And I think here too, one thing that's really important to emphasize is that this was out on the streets. These were movements that were incredibly active, and they were, if they weren't necessarily entirely overturning the existing orders, they were very loud, they were demonstrative, they were taking part in real kinds of reformist movements, and as they were in the streets, this was something that many reactionary sectors could find as being profoundly threatening, and as something that seemed to be overturning what they understood as the kind of order in their societies. And so the dictatorships that are referred to in the exhibits here are reacting to this kind of broader process. And it's important to recognize here that these dictatorships are reactionary, they're counter-revolutionary, they're pushing back some of the ways in which these movements had evolved. And these regimes, as they push back, they act as if they are on a war footing. So rather than reacting to kind of social movements that are seeking greater rights, seeking certain kinds of reform and potentially revolution, they are casting the people that they're fighting against as enemies of the state. And so they become these kinds of internal national security regimes that are explicitly targeting these reformist and revolutionary movements, and they're seeing them as enemies of the state in need of constant sort of vigilance, and also the institutional exceptional measures. And so when these dictatorships come into power, they implement states of siege, they use the most horrific forms of sovereign state power in order to prosecute what they are casting as an internal war. This leads, of course, to massive human rights violations and disappearances, and it leads to a systematic kind of attack on these groups that sought reform and revolution. And I think then one of the overall results of these dictatorships is that they really roll back these processes of reform and revolution. And by the time you get to the late 1980s and 1990s, you have a much more unipolar world, and one that's much more defined by limited kinds of democracy, where, especially at that time, pro-free market policies are ascendant, what we now call neoliberalism, and in fact what was already called neoliberalism across much of Latin America. So that is kind of one of the really broad sort of geopolitical points I just want to make, that I think that these are reactionary regimes that play this very powerful role in rolling back these reformist and revolutionary movements, often in the name of the Cold War, but really against groups that were fighting for more expansive forms of democracy, not a particular kind of necessarily Soviet-inspired communism or Maoist-inspired communism or something like that. Now, as these regimes are prosecuting their internal wars, they are also speaking about the fact that their societies had irrevocably fallen into chaos and breakdown. And so they seek a return there to what they refer to as a kind of tradition and order. And so as they do this, these regimes are not only attacking what you would probably guess from what I was talking about before, leftist political parties, labor organizations, student groups, peasant leagues, housing rights activists, and people who are explicitly involved in these processes of seeking greater rights, but they're also seeking out people like hippies. They're seeking out feminists. They're seeking out leftist musicians and artists. They're seeking out homosexuals, right? Many of these kinds of groups that represent for them the kind of breakdown of order that had existed in their societies before. And so you see this in the ways in which the repression plays out. This happens in things like after these regimes come into power, they force men to cut their long hair, shave their beards. They insist that women once again wear skirts and dresses in public, They can no longer have sort of suspicious pants on that taint them as kind of potentially being, feminists in the labor market and these kinds of things. They take part in mass raids that, yes, are looking for leftists and, yes, are looking for particular activists, but also sweep up all kinds of other people within them. And even US State Department officials would talk about the ways in which these regimes were puritanical and they were seeking out other kinds of dissidents, including common criminals. And so the net became kind of wider and wider. You also saw the ways in which, and this was very powerful in Chile, but it happened elsewhere as too, these regimes would explicitly remove places where squatter settlements had come in, where people were demanding kind of greater housing rights, and they would remove them from the downtown. They'd remove them from the wealthy areas of the city in an effort to kind of cleanse the city, but also, and they were very explicit about this, to reestablish what they said was the sort of proper socioeconomic order and the kinds of hierarchies that should exist in society. As they go about this, as I say, they kind of cast in a wide range of people, and in this there's a kind of racist, ethnocentric understanding of what national identification is. And here, especially in Brazil, but also elsewhere, Afro-Latin Americans, indigenous groups are also kind of wrapped up into the net of what these groups are reacting to. And so as I say, to kind of bring it back to where I started, one of the things that I found so impressive as I was wandering around these exhibits and thinking about the multiple things that they evoked for me was just how much these exhibits are reacting to the multiple forms of repression that these regimes represented. And as I say, it's not just about the kind of most infamous human rights violations that we know about. And it's also not about the specific forms of poverty and hardship that often occurred under these dictatorships, especially as they took part in really harsh kinds of neoliberal forms of restructuring. But it's also that they went about attacking things that deviated from their sense of what tradition was, their sense of kind of a heteronormative, patriarchal, and class racial hierarchies that were supposed to support these dictatorships. And in this too, I think that it's important to emphasize that here too you see some of the ways in which echoes from the past in current kind of rightist reaction throughout the Americas is seen from the ways in which these regimes acted. So one other thing I really want to emphasize too is that we should not be thinking about these things as kind of just historical and over there and in the past, but rather things that are very much alive and that we should be thinking about.
Yeah, fantastic. So Marjorie, there's so many rich themes to pick up in there, but I wonder if one in particular, this sort of notion of the multifarious dimensions of repression, including even the psychoanalytic sense of repression, becomes relevant to the ways that the streets became throughout the whole region. Complex battlegrounds, both materially and symbolically. So there's a tradition of thought from Baudelaire and the French revolutionary poets too, all the way to Benjamin, in which the urban street is this space of liberation, of self-fashioning, of the remaking of possibility, which becomes so important in reform and revolutionary movements. And then the repression of the street as this dreamed of space, from Hausmann onwards, of complete order, which is both physically and symbolically then a site of violence. But then the reclaiming of the street in the visual art that we see, both in the Arpilleras and upstairs, and perhaps often in poetry. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about this, what the struggle for the street came to mean in these historical moments.
Yes, thank you, Mark. I'm just going to share with you some of my impressions after seeing both the shows, At the Age of Seeing the Arpillera, and the one about sexual assault, especially taking place in this campus. At first, when I was entering the exhibit, The Age of Things, I felt that there were only echoes, as if one solitary voice in the street speaks, and there's a repercussion of the echo of that voice, because at the time of the dictatorships, in most of the countries of Latin America, but especially Chile, there was a curfew. And I remember, and I feel that it was a world without sounds. Almost you could, of course, hear music in your homes, but as if everything had become deaf, mute, and fearful. And what the Pinochet dictatorship wanted to emphasize that everything was like blank, like almost like at the figure of a glacier, that everything was frozen in a way, and that you could not venture into the streets. So there was the idea that the streets became not only fearful, but it also became like a jail. And Latin American societies go outside, they are vibrant, they play on the streets. There's the cafe culture, life in the parks. So what I believe these artists were trying to do is disturb the street and overthrow the fear. And if you can see the work of, and I'm very moved by these people because they belong to my generation. They're in their 60s now. And they were 40 years ago, they were extremely courageous. And you can see the work of Lottie Rosenfeld, which exactly what Mark is asking. They disturb the order of the streets. And she made crosses and signs, and it was very upsetting for the passerbys, for those that had cars, for almost the capitalistic world. So I do think that it was almost like a battleground between reclaiming, I would like to say, reclaiming joy, reclaiming creativity, and reclaiming sounds. Now, I like to just point out some things about the Arpilleras, and to go back to the work of Lepe and Didborn, and it's all here. The world they recreate, the sculptures, the bodies, it's a shattered world. It's a world that is beyond repair. And often you see a world beyond repair in the streets because you did see bodies swimming in the Mapocho River that crosses Santiago, but people didn't want to acknowledge it. So you have the broken bodies almost swimming to the city, and beyond restoration, life has left the city and the streets. But then if you look at the work of the Arpilleras, I find, and this is what we will be speaking about tomorrow, I find a bit of hope because they repair the shattered world through textile. These artists, in a way, and this is why it's so disheartening and it's so disturbing, you do not see restoration. You do not see mending. It's there. But the Arpilleras have the particular quality of creating small fragments of a vanished world that comes alive in memory, in the common scenes of everyday life, in the beauty of the Andes Mountains, in the sun. And through fragments you mend a vanished world. And I think in this sense, the Arpillera is disturbing, but at the same time it assembles what is fractured into a memory. The Arpilleras could be also called a memory quilt. And to go back to Mark's question and concept, when the arpilleristas, the women that make them, were working, they did not go into the streets. They were very much alone in their homes and filled with fear. And they were working in the early dawn because sometimes in the shanty towns where they live they had no electricity and they needed the light of day. And then they made the arpilleras at dawn, and I think that they told me that when morning arrived, they felt they they were alive again because night times were filled with terror.
That's so interesting. It's interesting that many of the arpilleras, not so much the ones we exhibited, but many of them concentrate on the dream of electrification.
Yeah.
That's an important project. And it is interesting, this, that electrification and making a claim on the power grid seems to be tied up with a broader struggle for rights to the city and democratization.
Have I told you that's my new project? Or
No,
are you setting me up? Okay. Well, thank you. I'd like to just comment quickly on something Marjorie said, and then I'll get back to the question of electrification. One of the things about, especially in Chile, and this was true of the dictatorships in Argentina and Brazil as well, but particularly in Chile, the image that the dictatorship always had of the previous years, of the Allende years, was one of just, sort of utter chaos and breakdown. It was the sort of final straw on this decrepit kind of democratic system that no longer worked, and that this sort of rabble had taken over the political processes. And this was just this, scary, troubling process, and it was all long food lines for people to get in. It was conflict in the streets. It was this dark period where subversives had kind of taken over, and then, it was also eventually going to lead to this armed leftist sort of revolution. But one of the things that always struck me when I did my oral histories with people and they talked about this period was just, it was a joyful time. It was a time where people were in the streets and there was music and they were going from demonstration to demonstration and it was fun and they were swept up in the possibilities of the moment. And it was a lot about possibility, and that sort of sense of possibility and excitement in life was also reflected everywhere in the, all of the buildings were plastered with different kinds of political slogans and really inventive kinds of murals and things like this, and that was a part of what was happening. And then, of course, one of the first things that the dictatorship does is not only to cast this all as breakdown chaos, and it's not to say that there weren't some very real problems under Allende, but it's not only that they did that, but they also just immediately paint over and draw over everything that happened. And so it becomes this white and gray kind of city that where you lose any sense of this sort of sense of color and light.
Yeah. So before we get to electricity, but I did want to just pick up again on your opening point in that light about repression, right? Because the basic psychoanalytic insight that repression and violent repression is precisely about destroying those aspects of the self that are most feared. And that one could imagine a reading develop that the various juntas, everything that they might have longed for secretly is precisely what's being attacked in the most violent, rooting out, including the very possibility of joy in the deepest sense. So it is so interesting, the contrast that you mentioned, Marjorie, between with the work of the Arpilleristas that is insisting on a reinstitution of joy, whether or not it's in terms of the pastoral or the energy of the dance or the kind, compassionate intimacy of women working together. And that the work of the conceptual artist upstairs, as important as it is fundamentally a critique. It is not about the reaffirmation of joy. It's almost as if that would have seemed...
It's cerebral.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering your thoughts on that. Yeah.
Well, I think that what Ed was saying, that there was joy, they could not take away the spirit. And an immense body of work has been written about the Holocaust, but I think the immensity of what we will learn is happening. What we will learn is in the future, not in what we have, because now, and I think historians, anthropologists, mostly historians and anthropologists, sociologists, because they're talking about life for example, under the most horrific of conditions, life in dictatorships, life in the ghettos. And there was a recent documentary about life in the Warsaw Ghetto, where people had readings, creative readings, poetry, music. And there was one scene in the movie, and I'm going to ask John to give the correct title, who will own a story, because I've changed titles, I think. Who? About the movie that we saw. The who will own our stories?
Oh,
Yeah.
who will tell our history?
Who will tell our history? I strongly recommend you to see it, because it's like this exhibit will stay with you. There is there is a moment where every character in the film, and they are people that exist, they're real people, but it's acted, decides that they need to be writers. So you see older people, younger people, middle-aged, children, all writing, because writing becomes a witness. So I think this art, but this conceptual art also wants us to know this is what happened, almost like a Primo Levi poem. I want to disturb your ear, I want to disturb your night. But the arpilleras have a very female and the best sense of what it means to be a woman, or what it could mean to be a man. It has a nurturing quality. I don't feel nurtured by the conceptual artist. And they kind of frighten me, because it's there. You cannot deny it. And I know this, I even know these artists that made these works, but when I see them, I just cannot say, I sat with this person having coffee and look what they're making. It's even more disturbing. I'm very curious about their mind. But women sit at a table and talk. And what is so poignant, they create a table with chairs and an empty space, because the missing person has not come for years. And that says it all. So I'm saying there is a quality to what you can hold with your hands, what you can touch. And I think we are feel more soothing, because textures are part of the ancient human experience. And they are recreated over and over again, and they are recreated in the arpillera. From ancient Greek times, from ancient Africa to modern Latin America. The textile, I would like to say that the textile has a voice, but it's a gentle voice. And the conceptual artists have a voice, but it's a very harsh voice for me.
But of course they would argue a necessary
Yes, yeah.
critique. But on the other hand, as you're speaking, I'm thinking of Baudrillard's famous sort of line, the great crisis of modernity is the struggle to reestablish symbolic exchange with the dead, which he argues human societies used to be predicated upon, and we lose that. It's very clear in the Arpilleras that that's going on, because the dead become co-present and are constantly moving in and out of those shadowlands that you talked about. But it does seem to me with a number of the artists upstairs, something like that is going on. Yeah. The way that the sandbox becomes a kind of topography that is shaped by the absent bodies, and the way that the nation itself is being continuously remapped, yes, in a horrific way, through the upside down figure of the artist, whose very body becomes, but there and in the art that's about sending things through the mail, the dead are sort of still with us. So it's not joy exactly, but it does seem to be about a dynamic threshold, and insisting that the unnamed dead, that the regime has tried hard not just to kill, but to render truly socially dead, that's not going to happen. The dead are still being offered a place back in the larger moral community. And that, you could argue, is a necessary precondition for the democratic struggle to reconstitute a society in which the dead are not completely exiled. So maybe
Yes.
something like that is happening.
I think you have said it beautifully, and it's, the show of the Arpilleras is called Between Absence and Presence, and yes, the dead are there. It may be in the unknown whereabouts, in the unknown male, in the body upside down. That could be a torture body. Of course, it is a torture body. And there is a dialogue with the dead and the restoring of morality to their life.
Right.
Yes, I would agree.
And that's where this question of hope comes in. I mean, this is a question that our students constantly raise, right? In dark times, is there any real possibility of hope? I mean, they're very capable of the critique. But that's this gets us back to the electricity. There is a vibrancy to a number of the Arpilleras, especially at the transitional period. Mm-hmm. It's not just about the denunciation of the horrors of neoliberalism and austerity, and of course there are Arpilleras that are specifically about the betrayal of those in power through refusing to rescue those in the mining accident and all that. But there's just a lot about the sheer joy of bringing electrification, that this is what the ballot box is going to allow. So I'd love to hear, I had no idea you were heading in that direction. But
okay. And again, I want to get to the electrification. One thing I did want to say about the juxtaposition of the exhibits, just as we're talking about that, I do think the Arpilleras move in all kinds of ways in terms of everyday life.
Yes.
So you see, yes, the very specifics of human rights abuses, but you also see, the particularities of kind of how and in what ways people are living everyday life during the regime in their homes. And this has things to do with, not having enough food or all these other kinds of things. Also, electrification in the houses.
Right.
And I'll get back to that in a second. But I do think one of the things that's happening in the exhibit here at the Broad is that it's also trying to recover not sort of those elements of everyday life that are hidden in that way, but also those kinds of things that are hidden, and there was a real struggle to even kind of get on the table or any kind of political agenda. And so this is particularly true, I think, in terms of sort of respect for sexuality, right? Issues of homosexuality and things like that. This is particularly true in just reacting, I think, a little bit more broadly to sort of silences of patriarchy that also permeated the left at times. And so the critiques are slightly different, and they're differently situated in those kinds of ways. And I do think that that's an important kind of distinction. A couple things on the electrification, since you asked. I think, so one of the things about the Arpilleras that's so important is that, not all, but many of these people were producing these Arpilleras in places that had been squatter settlements, and they were slowly consolidating squatter settlements. These had been established primarily in land seizures in the years leading up to the coup. This was actually one of the things that many in the dictatorship talked about as being, the chaos of the Allende years and right before. This was how and in what ways popular sectors were doing things that were upsetting property regimes, taking part in social mobilizations that were profoundly threatening. Yet, one of the things that's very impressive about most of these squatter settlements, and we were talking about this beforehand, is that they actually persist. The power of the claim for housing was so powerful that even the dictatorship, and yes, it did remove a number of these, but even the dictatorship tended to let these places remain. And so one of the big struggles in the dictatorship was whether or not these neighborhoods would get access to electricity or not, and how and under what conditions. Now there's a further wrinkle in that when the national protest really took off in 1983, many of them were based, had their most vibrant expression, their most lively expression, also their most joyous expression, often in these low-income areas. But among the things that happened there too was that actually people were often attacking electrical towers to cause widespread blackouts. This helped in terms of facilitating the protests at night, but it was also something that undercut the regime's claim that it was creating an orderly society, where they were providing sort of all the kinds of basic symbols of modernity to everybody. So this these electrical politics, forgive the pun, but they were extremely charged in all these kinds of ways, both in terms of redeeming some of the former claims that people who were demanding housing was for, but then also in terms of feeding the kinds of mass protest movements that took off in 1983, and also providing this other way within which to kind of, this tactic to fight against the dictatorship and to criticize the dictatorship.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. It's such a rich conversation, but we'd love to invite everybody to share your questions and thoughts about all these issues on the table.
I wanted just to add a comment about joy and reclaiming this joy, that if you go to the houses of the arpilleristas, you will always see made out of a Nescafe jar, the Nescafe jars, they put flowers, they have a garden, they have little herb gardens, basil, cilantro. It's like life itself continues, even though it has been so interrupted forever, because the constant surge interrupts the dailiness of life. But I've always felt that after I left, I was happy. Sometimes there's not a fancy meal, maybe a tomato, rice, and a fried egg. And I always thought that was the best meal I've had. And just the talking, and Mark, you talk about the reclaiming the dead and the dead entering the spaces of the living. But I felt that all of us were reclaiming our sense of humanity, our sense of belonging to a community. And I never felt this terrible feeling of anguish and sorrow after I left them. On the contrary, I think they gave each one of the people that visited them hope and joy and the recovering of humanity. And this is what I have carried with me all along. I think my most important experiences in my life as a writer has been to meet these women, and I carry them in my memory every day. So I don't know if you welcome any thoughts or.
That's so interesting, and that certainly speaks to the whole question of the role of poetry in the production and reclaiming of national communities. There's several wonderful arpilleras that are about making manifest the work of poetry. Maybe they all do that, but certainly some are specifically dedicated to Gabriel Mistral, or to Neruda himself, and to his home on
Isla Negra.
Isla Negra. They're so, and those are poems, right? Those are poetic corpuses that are that know all the horrors life can throw at you, but always insist that that's not the end of the story. Right? So it is interesting that the work of great poetry does, certainly in these Latin American contexts, does seem to be about the insistence that there's always more to a story than the obvious flattening out of life through the forces of existence, right? And so that there's that interest in, because I don't know how familiar the women have been with the history of Latin American literature, but the same themes seem to pop up again and again.
But they are familiar with poetry.
Yeah.
And there's a beautiful story that once Neruda was at a poetry reading, and he forgot his own verses, and the people in the audience knew them.
Yeah.
But I think that after I hear you speak, Mark, the idea of two metaphors come to mind: insistence and persistence. The insistence of of a kinder life and the persistence of memory. I think these two are the parallel lines, worlds that these women live in.
Right, there's a wonderful arpillera of the museum,
Yeah,
of the
Museum of Memory.
right, the Museum of Memory, right? And it's actually quite a brilliant design
Yes.
because it has the three different levels. You see the burning of the presidential palace, right? That horrific moment where you can imagine all hope is lost. You see the padilla, right? The grill, the electric instrument of electricity, and then you have on the top floor the arpilleras themselves.
Yes.
The irrepressible, and they're filled with color.
Yeah.
And then what cuts across all three levels are all these question marks, right? Asking where they are, where are the disappeared? It's quite it's doing it's quite a sophisticated piece.
Yes.
Because it seems to be at one level it lays out a kind of temporal progression, and then but I still feel like the dead are moving back and forth, in that amazing space.
One comment just in response to what you both are kind of talking about. One of the things that was so defining of so many of the social movements broadly, but particularly the housing movements, was that as they established their neighborhoods, it was so important to be organized in order to create streets, in order to create latrines, in order to have childcare for your family members when you were out doing these kinds of things.
Supermarket, almacén.
Right, yeah, right, and sort of popular ollas comunas and these kinds of things, yeah? These kind of popular kitchens that they made together. And so, and that intense, and so all of the squatter settlements when they were first formed right after land seizures, they were intensely organized places. And they also had a real strong emphasis on solidarity. And they talked about it very much in these terms, just how important solidarity was, the importance of being kind of a good neighbor, and so much of this. And, the dictatorship, often disappeared a lot of the leaders from these communities, also severed the sort of links that made it possible for those forms of solidarity to kind of be expressed as they had been before. But there was this slow kind of ants work process of which the arpilleras were thickly engaged, of reclaiming the possibility for connection and solidarity, reclaiming an ability to do the forms of solidarity that made these social movements possible in the first place. And this is this was a powerful process, and it was something that really was vibrant during the 1980s when the national protests came off. And then one of the sort of sad parts about the return to democracy is that a lot of those organizations kind of died, because they had been so focused on fighting against the dictatorship, and also it was in this much more sort of hyper-market environment of neoliberal Chile in the 1990s. So you did have these kind of like reconstitution of some forms of solidarity, but it was a very difficult struggle in a very different kind of context.
Right, and for Africanists, the parallels are really striking. So South Africa during the state of emergency period was known for these extraordinary street committees in Soweto and really every town. I mean, the United Democratic Front was all about the literal remaking of solidarity in the provision of social services. And then after Mandela comes out of prison, there's the first call is for the dissolution of those street committees and for the United Democratic Front, and what turns out to be the great compromise with neoliberal economics that leads to all the unresolved contradictions. So there's a sort of parallel to what the return to democracy so often has come to mean. But that reclaiming of solidarity, that is one of the most interesting things in the Arpilleras. Just at the moment that's most poignant, there's one that I love that is one of the very first ones that we show, and it's of the mothers walking the streets right before they know of one another, and they look both isolated, and they're going to the morgue, they're going to the judicial tribunal, the hospital, and so forth. And they seem to be looking into one another's face. And it's a kind of mirror, right? they're recognizing in one another this aching absence of whoever it is that they're looking for. And then in the next one, you see them gathered together, and they're sort of calling a world into being around in the circles. And that story of the very tangible, as you say, physical way through the work of textiles, of texture in textiles itself, is the most fundamental remaking of the sociality that the regime had been fracturing. Yeah.
Is there any known opposition to the electrification of the area by locals there? Or is it all pretty much enthusiasm?
No, it was, it's a good question, but primarily no. I mean, it was one thing that the assertion for a right to housing was also about a right to a home that was going to be integrated into the city. And so it included then suppositions about the kinds of infrastructures that should extend to that home. So there were a series of protests, especially, so the dictatorship often, as I said, kind of ultimately responded to the housing rights sort of movement, but they did remove a lot of neighborhoods to further parts of the city. If those areas didn't have electricity, if they didn't have access to public transportation or things like that, it was very common for people to take part in protests in the middle of the dictatorship, and even at some of the points where the dictatorship was sort of its most repressive. It also tended to be women that tended to take part in those protests. And they often did that as explicitly as mothers. They kind of knew, they claimed that they knew sort of what was best, but they made this also as kind of an apolitical claim, right? It was something that, as Chileans, they kind of deserved this, and this was not supposed to be something about politics. And that was something that the dictatorship kind of said too, and so they made that claim sort of in that register. So no, it was something that was a kind of, I would say, a general claim that resonated quite widely and was very powerful. Yeah.
And were there struggles, I mean, again, I'm thinking through the African lens, where often, right, there's a general principle that to be part of that moral citizenship requires the state to provide fundamental services like electricity, but there's a lot of debate over what it means to be a ratepayer, and municipalities' insistence that, quote, now that democracy has come, everybody should, quote, pay their full share,
Yes.
Which often, because of the way these things are structured, it poses disproportionate burdens on very vulnerable households.
Right. No, absolutely. And this was a big issue. So there's two things going on here. One, the entire housing movement broadly was able to push back efforts on the part of the dictatorship to claim that housing should no longer be a right, but rather a good in the marketplace. And so you have these particular moments, late 70s, there's the reemergence of land seizures. From 1983 to 1986, there's the kind of reemergence of land seizures. And as the dictatorship is trying to say that it's only going to be a good in the marketplace that you see, that's a right that you have through your pocketbook, that gets pushed back, and in a very impressive kind of way. So this kind of notion that housing is a right remains. Electricity is more complicated because electricity is sort of stands between being a good in the marketplace and potentially a right that should be extension of your right to housing. What ultimately happens is most people become indebted consumers. Right. And electricity bills are a really big part of the way in which a lot of low-income people become extremely indebted. Right. And that also contributes to atomization. People don't want to talk about being indebted, this kind of thing. So you have that tension in a real way, and I think ultimately electricity, and also electricity gets privatized. The grid gets privatized. Yeah, in this sort of mass sell-off towards the end of the dictatorship that has shown to be a fairly corrupt process. But this leads to this kind of ultimate commodification of electricity. You know? Right. Even though the original claim rested on a citizenship right. Right. Yeah.
Huh. So welcome to the late modern world, which
exactly,
which is a giant debtor's prison, as we know. Yeah. Yeah.
To follow up on that previous question, was there much education on how this electricity was created or formed in the area for these communities to the locals there, or did they just see lights and the benefits of it rather than any of the fallacies in the sense of
Yeah, I'm gonna have to send you my new work. I mean, it's actually complicated. So one thing that has been stunning to me about this research is that as I was reading about electricity, I found, and I'll get to your question, I think, but this will answer it in a way. I found social welfare bureaucracy officials sitting at the table with development aid folks who were connected to things like the World Bank, sitting with security officials. And so the worst and most problematic security bureaucracies in the dictatorship, things like the CNI and others, that they're all sitting there together talking about how do we extend electricity. So there's this kind of development imperative to bring electricity, which I think by and large most citizens want. You know, they're stealing from the grid, they're trying to figure out ways to make claims for the grid. But then there's also this development paradigm to say, oh, the dictatorship is providing, we're reducing minimum, sort of this minimalist understanding of poverty, we're dealing with that. So we are providing electricity to the lowest income people. Look at what we're actually sort of doing. This is different than this inactive kind of Allende period where things were at a standstill. So it was about providing these particular kinds of things. But then the security officials are there too, because this is a way in which they're really going to be able to identify people in these different neighborhoods. So a lot of things come together in terms of how and in what ways this sort of process of electrification happened and happened so swiftly during the dictatorship.
But then zooming ahead, what's the historical moment then when a new kind of claim to moral citizenship founded on clean energy, on a kind of remaking of the entire energy system becomes key to a sort of new claim on what the nation is supposed to be?
That's a great question. And Marjorie, I don't know if you have thoughts about this, but I mean, one of the real keys here is that there begins to be highly publicized projects in the far south of Chile that are hydroelectric dam projects that are very, environmentally destructive and dispossess huge numbers of people,
Including indigenous
including indigenous people.
Yeah.
So you have then a tie into
Right.
environmental rights movements and indigenous rights movements
Right.
into the housing rights movement.
And then there's the parallel to Brazil, right?
Yes.
Yes. The surprising common cause that gets made in Brazil between people in shanty towns and indigenous communities that begin to make all these shared connections about an environmentally rapacious regime that is producing poverty everywhere it goes. Right? As
And I
people
think
say.
this is reclaiming a new kind of citizenship, right? One that is about, wide-ranging solidarities and trying to bring together very different, diverse kinds of groups. And then, the irony too that people fought very hard for this, and then they find themselves as a part of this grid that's making them indebted and is contributing to, sort of immiseration, dispossession, and environmental destruction.
Right.
And where are we now?
Yeah.
And it goes back, the fundamentals of liberation theology are very much alive now. And the idea that you cannot have justice if you have an impoverished society. So I think you said how the electricity works or what they know, but they know a fundamental concept that they want to live in it. They are trying their best to eradicate poverty in the sense to have electricity, to have running water, to be able to have a television, a radio. But in a way, modern technology and the internet has democratized people a lot in Chile, because everybody has like a small cell phone, computers, and they're kind of part of the larger world. They are not so isolated as they were before. So in that way, it has helped. At the same time, sometimes modern technology, it's a two-edged sword. The telephone is an addiction that all of us are part of. But I think that they have internalized the values of citizenship in a very deep way, even more, I find, than this is supposed to be an important democracy, but I question it all the time because people don't complain about lack of health care and brutal prices of education for their families. But in Latin America, I think they know what is the democratic way somehow. I think the middle class in the United States doesn't speak much, doesn't protest. They take everything it's an apathy to this democracy, which we didn't have democracy, but people were not apathetic. We reclaim the values of democracy.
Do you have any thought on why the middle class isn't as vocal?
Here, it's my own opinion, and I'm just a writer. I'm not political, but I think the whole day, I think this country, this beautiful metaphor of a sleeping giant. America to me is a sleeping giant, but it's the giant is exploding right now. People go, I think, coming here as an immigrant, I've seen so much kindness in this country, but this kindness goes together with so much ignorance about the other world. And how can I say, people go about their work, picking up their children, they go to church. But this, to me, I've always found very mechanical actions. This is what you do, and maybe Saturday you empty the garbage, and I don't know. Life is very methodical, but sometimes I find, where is the meaning to this life? Of course I'm generalizing, but this is what I see. A world that doesn't want to be disturbed with interruptions, and a world that likes to be thoughtless. I've noticed that. I mean, ignorance is considered a virtue in some places. So it's very harsh what I'm saying, but I have felt that way.
It goes to some, these are obviously issues of the moment that are so important that many contemporary artists here as well are struggling over, which is how do you reimagine the social given a cultural milieu and a cultural industry that is so predicated on dreams of autonomy, right? That freedom becomes the freedom to be atomized and therefore not pay taxes and then that's one part. And I think the other part, though, goes to this question of debt and to that even in a supposed time of prosperity and economic vitality, as we're supposedly in, most middle-class Americans don't actually feel that. They're overwhelmed by anxiety over debt or the possibilities of ever encroaching and deepening debt. And it's harder to mobilize. That's what makes this election so fascinating, right? Because there are voices that are arguing for a total undoing of basic foundational debt relations. And I think that's one of the great unsolved questions, not just here, but globally. Are debtors going to find a way to reimagine relations of social control and anxiety in ways that reproduce, that recreate the possibility of solidarity and a new form of social compact?
Sorry for what I said. I didn't mean to, but these are my thoughts. A thoughtless world, and a lot of this modern civilization likes the thoughtless world because it's not disturbing. It's not at the edge of things.
Okay.
conceptual art is male and it's violent or something. And so I guess first point of question is, how did this, where were the men in Chile? Why weren't the juxtaposition in my mind was it just like traditional production all the time? So why weren't early fathers or the husbands? Why, is there any record of men in there or why?
It's a very poignant question, and it's true what you're saying, conceptual art, the male, the violence, the women, almost like a gender division. But this is a question that everyone asks, and I somehow will answer you from what I've learned from others. The husbands of these arpilleristas either were taken, were disappeared, they're forgone, or the children, but at the same time they were traditional males that did not express their emotions, did not sew, men can sew, they did not pick up needles. And also, let's say they belong to the traditional political parties. For example, they belong to the Communist Party. And these women, even though they could have belonged to the Communist Party or to other parties, they were not in the centers of power. They were in the edge, in the margins. So they could invent themselves easier. A man that was like a secretary of the Communist Party, you would never catch him making an arpillera or even grieving, because they behave according to a traditional male ideological pattern. So even the men in supposedly very enlightened times where you were working to have a socialist country, they behave like traditional males. So the behavior is so categorized based on gender. Now, this may not be politically correct, but I'm above that now. I do believe that I think it's beautiful to say that women are nurturers and that women sew and use the needles, because we are different. This is who we are. And I'm not just saying the biology is different, but the way we intuit the world is different. And what is wrong, like the French, vive la différence. What is wrong with that beautiful difference? That doesn't mean that a man cannot be intuitive, kind, sewing, but these are female characteristics that have mobilized the world, from the Russian Revolution, from the poetry of Anna Akhmatova, the music of Violeta Parra, are these qualities that have created a more just world. And I think that why not let the qualities that are supposed to be feminine be governing? That would be a true radical revolution, that the world is more governed according to women than to men, because men are a disaster right now, all over. Yeah, thank you, John. Yeah.
It is a much more sexist society. Marjorie and I were stuck in traffic, and there were some young hooligans making trouble, and the police came. And the police always had one man and one woman.
In Chile.
And I didn't get why they always had a woman and a man until I saw the dynamics of what happened. That the police came, and the boisterous young guys making trouble, they were ashamed to talk back to the woman because of the sexual and the respect for the woman. And I thought that was very clever of them to have a man and a woman go together for crowd control and hooligan control and stuff, because at least 10 years ago we saw it work. We saw the whole thing unfold.
Can I make one comment on that? In Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, this wonderful novel, the mother of the family during this moment of sort of intense political repression that's
Right.
being led by one of her sons, she kind of steps out into the public sphere and shames her son, right? And it's this mother that does this. But this is something that this way, in this very gendered way, in which mothers were able to shame the regime, in which there was a very feminine space for critique. It was a powerful space in these dictatorships. And so the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina were the ones that could kind of have some of the most effective space with which to denounce what was happening. Similarly, the mothers of the disappeared in Chile were able to create these kinds of networks and provide this kind of powerful space for critique. And they had some measure of protection as mothers and also as claims to being just concerned about this as mothers. And so it was also kind of important and limiting in many cases that they had to make these critiques in a kind of apolitical register. That said, I do think one of the things that does happen with the arpilleras is that they're also productive and they allow for movement. And so while there is this very constraining overall kind of gender dynamic that I think is problematized in a lot of the material here in very impressive ways, and not so much in the arpilleras, I do also want to emphasize that while that is the overall kind of gender dynamic in this particular space within which mothers can come and criticize, one of the things about the arpilleras is that they also are this kind of creative moving space that allows for these new openings of solidarity that then other people can come in, can interact with them, develop their kinds of critiques.
And a particularly interesting example of that might be the one, the arpilleras that are specifically in reference to the mining disaster, right? Because there was a sort of failure even of the opposition of political parties, right?
Yes.
To actually mobilize for the rescue. And it really, it was the women, right, making
Yes.
claims as wives and mothers that were able quite effectively to manipulate the media industry so that resources actually had to go into the rescue
Yes.
operation,
I
right?
mean, really, the miners, the 33 miners, would have not been saved, would have died if it were for the women. And the women just, this is what, when I say how people mobilize in South America, that is something very different from the US. They actually took they went with tents, they took their mattresses, they took their children, and stayed right by the edge of the mine and mobilized the whole country to find, and they said that they knew they were alive. And chances were but they, in a way, you have to believe in something. This is what I tell my students. You have to have the belief. There was a belief in the intuition. There was a belief that they could be rescued. And that belief caused the whole world to mobilize, because even NASA did this capsule and other European nations helped. So one man from the bottom of the earth came to the light. The whole world was watching the miners, but it was the women that mobilized them. And there were many stories. I have a friend that likes to write about gossipy things, and she's always on TV, and she wrote about a miner that had a lover and a wife, and they were worried about who was going to go greet him. And that kind of like, this was like the topic that the whole country talked about. I think it was a stupid topic, but they wanted to just it was so, to dissipate somehow the hardness. But the women mobilized the rescue of the miners, no question. And they mobilized it as mothers, as wives, and they even brought a school to their tents. They asked the teachers to come to the mine, and the children were taught right there. And they stayed there for 2 months.
As a kind of occupation.
Yes.
I mean,
They occupy that.
I do think this is a tricky and somewhat problematic space. One of the things that the housing movement was about was also kind of, protecting the family. It also had prominent places within which women could be active. This gave them a kind of moral superiority, a sense that this is not about politics. It's not sullied by the sort of male political kind of world. But it does depend a little bit on these kind of, particular juxtapositions of what a male domain and what a female domain is. And there is there's a long-term consistency to a lot of that. And again, I don't want to deny how productive that's been and how important it's been in terms of creating forms of solidarity. But it is something that's surprisingly consistent, or it's very persistent in terms of the ways in which claims are made and the ways in which notions of victimhood are often played out and that kind of thing.
I know we're moving towards the close, but one of the things that I really do love about what the curatorial team did here, Carla and her colleagues, was the insistence on history and also changing the very nature of space, especially global space, so that as you enter the core part of the exhibition, there's that amazing timeline that doesn't limit itself only to the countries under discussion, but really is global and situated so that you have the entire hemisphere, north and south, embedded, and so that we get these Cold War narratives and so forth. And it just seems that's such an important intervention for a major contemporary art institution to really take history seriously, even though history ends up looking very different, by the time you go through the whole show. And I think that's just a model for where contemporary art historical practice should be. For those of you who've seen the exhibition that we developed at the MSU Museum with the Sister Survivors, they were very mindful, and the most crucial political claim they kept on making was the essential nature of a timeline, that what this administration had denied was that there was any history here other than the history of one particular bad actor, but that rather that there was an institutional set of histories that had to be taken seriously, which is why we have, hundreds of panels and sometimes scenes of a timeline. So I know we often beat up on narrative linear historicity, but it is a very powerful political weapon, and it's wonderful to see it brilliantly integrated into this installation, and which I hope everybody's had a chance to go through otherwise you're open again tomorrow, right? So, yep, right. So
I would make a plug for complex linearity, and I think that
complex.
Exhibit does it very nicely.
Yes,
right?
it absolutely does.
Yeah.
Right. Anyway, thanks so much to the education team here and to the curatorial team. It's a wonderful partnership to be able to have these conversations. We'll be doing two things with Marjorie tomorrow. At 4 o'clock, we're going to start here. The Arca Poetry Center is going to assemble at the doors, and I understand it's going to have a poetry walk from one museum to the other. So bring your poems in 3 languages at least. And then at 5:30, at 5:30, Marjorie will talk to us about this question of threads of hope. Is hope possible at historical moments like the ones we've seen and the ones we're in right now? There can't be a more vital question. So thanks again for everybody for coming out tonight, and with any luck, we'll see you tomorrow as well.
Thank you.
Thanks.